So Jason is slowly but surely building our urban design chops and with the help of folks like David and others. So Jason, thank you for being here and thank you for introducing David.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everyone. It's great to introduce my close friend and long-term friend, David Bagnoli, and colleague, uh, who we've known each other for a long time. Let's just leave it at that. Um, so David and I met in undergraduate education at Notre Dame. I'd like to say that we were both more or less American suburban kids who were eager to study architecture, but we were still, as undergrads, obviously trying to understand what it meant to be architecture students. And among the most profound things we did as undergrads, and as many of you in this room have also done, is study in Rome and go abroad and see the world. Now, seeing the world in the late 1989 to 1990 was a little different than today because we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have this ubiquitous access to information to places around the world. And so the world really did seem incredibly distant, incredibly exotic. You saw stuff in history books at second year studio or class, and now you wanted to go stand in front of these buildings and how thrilling that would be. So Dave and I both went there, with this largely suburban experience, lived experience. And of course, like many students who go to Rome or to other places abroad, we suddenly are thrust into the heart of living in this significant city, of course, a great dense city. And we're learning what a city is about at that point. And one of the early moments that Dave and I, we shared many things together, but one of the things Dave and I both remember quite vividly was January 1990. We had just spent a month on Eurail passes traveling to Spain and France and Denmark and Germany and all sorts of other places, Austria. And suddenly we're back in Rome. The spring semester is about to start. We have a day before classes start. We both run into each other in the city, and then we say it's a beautiful spring, like early winter uh, or early spring day in January, and we say let's get some groceries and go up on the Gianicolo at the Doria Pamphili, and let's have a picnic up there. So we went up there. We're sitting under the umbrella pines. We're looking out over the roofscape of Rome, and we both agree we had just seen all these incredible cities for the first time, and Rome had a majesty and a power that none of these other cities had. We were truly seduced and convinced by Roman urbanism. And so since that moment, Dave and I have developed our careers around trying to continue that understanding of urbanism, digging deeper into it, and bringing the idea of cities in various contexts. Of course, the American context is very different than the Italian context, but the key characteristics of density, of public space, the public realm, of public interaction in the public realm, the vividness of that, the mixture of use, the mixture of people in public space. We were all fascinated by that. Dave has had a remarkable career since those early days. We knew each other. He served in the United States Air Force to serve out his obligation after being an ROTC student. That was at a very difficult time to be in the military. It was during the Afghan invasion and the um, invasion of Iraq. But he subsequently left the military, went to grad school at University of Pennsylvania. One of his critics there was William Rahn, who has an incredible practice based out of Boston. When I eventually moved back to the US after time in grad school and teaching in Rome, I interviewed with William Rahn with Dave as Dave's recommendation. He's the only firm I ever went to that turned me down for a job. He said, "No, I don't think you're a good fit with your traditional architectural experience." But I was envious of the work that Dave was doing there. If you don't know Williams Rahn work, it's really beautiful, very well detailed and thoughtful work. Dave subsequently had reason to move to Washington, D.C. He eventually decides to go out on his own with a partner and set up his own practice. I was a principal at Hart Howerton at the time, and we were going back and forth to talk about the ins and outs of setting up a practice. And I have to say, when I finally came to Catholic University and took my students over to visit his firm, which he so graciously hosted us over there, StudioMB, I was really amazed at how his firm represents what I always felt was the ideal type of practice. They do urban design, they do housing, they do civic buildings, they do master plans, they do civic buildings of all sorts. They've won awards for renovating a church into housing. They built a number of buildings on the wharf that you're about to see. They built houses. They've done university work. So it's really a testament to Dave's, kind of vision of being an architect. And there's really no bounds to being an architect. And I think his practice is one we should all really understand and emulate when we're in our early days and trying to figure out how we might be a professional later in life. So with all that said, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Bagnoli to all of you. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Jason. As he said, we started school in the 80s, and so this technology may elude me. Let me go ahead. Right. And then third button up, I hear for full screen. Everybody see that? Yep. Can you guys hear me out there? Yeah. Jason really couldn't have set this up any better for me, because what I thought I would talk about tonight was really more directed towards the third year studios. But as I kind of reflected on the fact that there's going to be folks outside of the third year that I'll be talking to, I thought I might take a step back and kind of share a couple of thoughts of how I got to where I am, and maybe a type of project that we've worked on that ties together some of those lessons that Jason talked about. So I have to say thank you to Jason. I've taught up at Catholic. I've taught graduate level urban design for many, many years. My first class up here was in 2006. Randy talked to our studio today about the plan for Monroe Avenue. That was our project in 2006. There was nothing out there in the studio. We taught with Terry Williams, who used to be here, who's since passed away, was actually looking at the urban design outside of the front gate of Catholic. So I've had the opportunity to come back here many times, including this summer, where I had a few folks out there in the audience with Jason and Chandler from my office doing an urban design studio. And so when Elizabeth approached me and said, would you be interested in teaching the third year housing and urban design studio? I knew Jason had kind of started that program across the metro here because I was a jury on a number of projects last year. So I thought for a moment, because I hadn't actually had the opportunity to teach third years, and so I asked her for a bit of time. So I reflected on what that might be and what it is that I think a third year student is capable of achieving. And it quickly dawned on me that year that Jason and I spent was the most foundational year of my entire career. I learned a lot of stuff since then, and I knew some things before then, but that year in Rome really set, I think, me up for the type of interest that I came back with and the type of practice that we've established since then. And so we had the opportunity to study in Rome that third year. And so I thought I would kind of start with this image here. Yes, that's Jason and I, and I'm going to try and reduce Jason here if I can. That's Jason and I in our class in Rome. It was pretty tight quarters. Over there, we lived and worked right in Campus Martius, which is right by the Piazza Navona. For those of you who've had the opportunity to study over there, the building was right on Via Monterone. Jason and I spent a lot of time eating lunch outside the Pantheon there. But, when you're in Rome, there's a lot of things to learn. But when we were in Rome, there was a lot of stuff happening in Notre Dame's program that I think have relevance to what's happening here at Catholic today. So, Notre Dame at the time had recently transitioned from a kind of modernist-based program when I was a freshman and a sophomore with Jason to having just recently hired a classical educator, Thomas Gordon Smith, who implemented a classical program similar to kind of where you guys are at, although I will say Catholic's a bit more open-minded in terms of how some of these students were able to explore different ideas. At Notre Dame, I think we learned a lot from our faculty, but we learned a lot from what our faculty were talking to each other about. And so we had faculty had honest dialogues about the role of traditional architecture and the role of modern architecture and some of the faults that might have been apparent by then in the late 80s. And so I see a real kind of similarity. And I saw that when Elizabeth asked me to come over, that this is a really similar moment to kind of think about the role of traditional urban design and the role of contemporary architecture within that. And it's a lot of what we talked about when we were in Rome. And so while that was what was happening at Notre Dame, what was happening in a broader world of architecture was this dialogue between the folks that were in the Colin Rowe School of Urban Design. Colin was a teacher at Cornell. Cornell had its program there in Rome, right around the corner from ours. And he was also a lecturer of ours when we were there. And if you've never read Colin Rowe, good luck. He's a bit of a broad thinker and a broad speaker, but he has some really rich ideas. And his ideas were pretty much the first that you can point to that started to challenge the precepts of modern urban and city planning against the kind of Villerejues that Corbu had been preaching. And so that led to folks like Leon Creer and Rob Creer before him, his brother. And interestingly, we had some folks who were pretty plugged into that when we were there. So we had this kind of crazy conversation happening between the faculty, and then we had all of the students. And I will say that I learned so much from people like Jason and other classmates by the dialogue and the kind of open conversation that we went through, and the role of kind of traditional practice in architecture, traditional urban design, and the role of kind of contemporary living and how modernism has a role in the world of architecture. So when you think about Rome, and that was kind of what was happening, Rome is for those who've not been there, Rome is this kind of, it's this crazy place that's got thousands of years of history. You've got these remnants of Roman Empire kind of scattered about the city that then have this medieval kind of maze of streets that's kind of woven over that. And that's the medieval reality of what Rome is. And then there's these moments of Renaissance ideal interventions. And so this diagram from Michael Dennis's book, which one of my students may here turn me on to, is a diagram that shows the kind of medieval web of streets in Rome with these kind of moments that are introduced, these kind of idealized Renaissance moments that come in to the city. And so it was a real good laboratory for us to learn about urban design, but also about architecture and the role of architecture within an urban setting. And so I thought that I could maybe share three big topics today as I think about how we put all this together and talk about the work of our firm. We do a lot of different types of projects, but ostensibly I'm here to talk a little bit about housing and urban design, so I'm going to try and hit those. So I thought I'd hit on three topics and kind of show you three projects that to a greater or lesser degree balance those three issues. The first issue is solid versus void. The second issue is the use of precedent in what we do. And the third issue is the question of context and how do you think about context? So solid and void, precedent, and context. So taking each of those kind of individually, there's this new book out about the urban design legacy of Colin Rowe that I just finished reading, which is a wonderful kind of summary of his students talking about the impact that Colin had on them. And so some of these quotes I've taken from that book, but some of those are from his students as well. And maybe you can't read it because we've got the thing up here. Is there a way to hide that? No. Yes? Hide video panel or name? Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. Okay. So the tradition of modern architecture has tended to produce objects rather than space, been involved with problems of the built solid and very little with the problems of the unbuilt void. How do you make a city if all buildings proclaim themselves as objects? And of course, you all have already started hearing about this in your studies, but the urban components of Leon Creer, which were fairly new. We were in Rome in 89. This was done in 1983, as opposed to kind of the Villerejue's diagram that you see there from Corbu, which actually manifested itself in a lot of different styles. This is Westover Place here in the Westchester Place here in Washington, which are beautifully detailed, traditional looking buildings that when you put them on the screen adjacent to the Villerejue's, you don't see much difference in their response to the city. And so I kind of took away from this idea of subject of solid and void that it really wasn't about the design of the building. It was more about the design of the streets and the public spaces these buildings fronted. And I think Creer's diagram, which Randy shared with the class at the very beginning of our 302 thinking here, of the idea of the public realm and the private realm coming together to create a civic realm is what we left with Rome with and got to kind of study while we were there. So that's the first topic. The second topic is really the use of precedent. When you're in Rome, it's hard to avoid the use of precedent and how precedent changes over time. And so the idea that precedents are the history of ideas gathered to empower designers and manipulate architectural ideas and devise prior knowledge for further exploration. I can't find a better example of how we learned this in Rome than kind of trudging through the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla or some of the basilicas in the Roman Forum, and then being told that, okay, look at this plan, which didn't have a hierarchy in terms of its direction, and look at what the early Christian basilicas did in terms of changing that hierarchy and putting an apse at the end and creating a kind of front and a back. And then how does that get translated into St. Peter's? Not just St. Peter's that we see today with the San Gallo extension to Michelangelo's kind of Greek cross, but also the medieval St. Peter's, which is a direct reflection of the idea of precedent. And so that was something that stuck with me, this idea of precedent being manipulated, not just in terms of understanding the classical orders, but the idea of precedent being used as a way to solve problems because where there was a hierarchy and the procession of a liturgical event happening in a Catholic church, very different than the Baths of Caracalla. There was processionaire, of course, but very different from the kind of basilica that were in the Roman Forum. The idea of using precedent to kind of solve new problems while understanding how they did that previously. And then the last idea is of context. And contextualism to me really, another quote from this wonderful book, a proposition about the interdependence of architecture and city form, recognizes architecture is both an object of special interest and an element in the background of urban fabric. This is a wonderful museum. I'm not sure if anybody's been to Berlin Island, that David Chipperfield has recently done. He did this wonderful master plan and tied his new contemporary building into the context of Museum Island, which has these range of kind of traditional and classical buildings that kind of surround the site. And it kind of nestles in there with this amazing, I guess I can't move that talking thing here. Yeah, this amazing kind of contemporary introduction. It matches the context of its scale, the context of its materiality, its riverfront location, the kind of piered entry into the existing museum that's there. And so this idea of context was another one that we took away, that I certainly took away. So solid and void, precedent, and context. So what does that mean? Jason mentioned I came back, I had some time I had to do in the Air Force where I met my wife. I went back to graduate school at Penn, and I was really fascinated with the idea of American urbanism, even before I went back to graduate school. But certainly as I got to graduate school, I was really fascinated with how do you take all those lessons of this medieval city with these Renaissance ideals kind of plastered on top of it. How do you deal with that in an American context? And so I had the opportunity to do a lot of different types of projects, a lot of urban design projects, some of which you see here, and then also some buildings that kind of fit within those contexts. And so I learned a lot from the folks that I had the opportunity to work for, but as you know, a lot of you will do as you get older, you start to think, well, what if I did this on my own, and what does that mean, and how do you establish a practice, and what kind of work does that practice want to do? And I knew, my business partner and I knew that we wanted to do work of a full range of project types. And so we had this kind of palette of experience that we had brought to the practice, including urban design and master planning, but also this idea of contextual kind of regionalism that found its way into a lot of our projects. And so, you know, here's a couple of projects from some of those days. The precedents for those and the context of those are up high, and the projects down low are some of my personal favorites that I've done. I've had the opportunity to do over the years. So just this is a hotel I did in Napa, California, the Carneros Inn. I did this when I was probably, I guess we opened this hotel in 2004, it opened. So I started this project right out of Penn and developed it. But this idea of how do you use the public-private relationship of a Charleston side yard house to create a bungalow that allows somebody, which was part of what the client wanted, to take a shower naked outside so that somebody beside him couldn't. And how do you solve that problem? I looked to the precedent of the Charleston side yard house, which has these kind of solid rows of walls that prevent people from looking from one garden into the next. Similarly, how do you organize these in a way that they start to respond to each other, these bungalows? And so I looked to the kind of bungalow housing of California that was certainly really prevalent in the 1930s as a kind of lesson to that. And then just architectural precedent, the Hopkiln, I gotta put my glasses on for this one. The Hopkiln Winery in Sonoma with its kind of three sisters and how that informs a public banquet hall. It's recognizable in its precedent and its context in a place that really didn't have any context. This was basically a trailer park that the developer had bought and converted to this hotel in his mind and hired us to kind of create these homes and hotel rooms. Similarly, since the practice has started, we've taken buildings from all over the place and thought about how we can learn from those. So my studio has been doing what we do in our office. We highlight a building every week that a staff member brings, and I've asked my students to bring in precedents to talk about precedents. So we're all thinking about precedent because that's how I learned, rather than trying to design this spaceship that landed in the middle of a space and I'm supposed to be brilliant enough to figure out how to solve all the problems. But how does a building sit in its landscape is also a problem of urban design. The Montgomery County Farm that you see there, translated to Glenstone, that you see there, led to a project of ours that's almost done up in Montgomery County, this carousel roundhouse that you see at the bottom there. Or how does this row house development in Venice, California, inform a project of ours down at 5th and Q? So the idea of context and precedent and solid versus void is always there in the work. And so I thought what I would do today, I'm doing pretty good on time, is to talk about three projects that are relative to the urban design studio portion of what we're doing in 302, but also to the housing. And so I have two housing projects and one master plan. And they're all about urban architecture and dialogue with the context of the city. We're fortunate enough as a firm to be practicing here in Washington, but we do stuff all over the Mid-Atlantic. We've done stuff as far west as Oregon and Iowa and Texas. But we do believe that architecture is responsible for itself and its background. And so how do you take these three ideas, these ideas of solid void, what's the role of the building in the city and the building in its site, the idea of precedent, what can you learn from what's been done before, and then the idea of context in terms of how do you deal with context in a city like Washington? And some of these have a pretty firm context. Some of these are big empty sites that you not too different than the site across the railroad tracks here that we just started on today. So I thought I'd start with the Washington Fish Market. This is not a housing project. It is down at the wharf. It is a fascinating part of the city. Hopefully everybody's seen the wharf and been to the fish market. Our work at the fish market, it involved diving deep into a site that had a history. And I would treat that as context, but it didn't really have any buildings left. And so just to give you a sense of what that history was and the layers of history, not unlike what we learned in Rome when I was talking about those layers of Roman, medieval, and Renaissance or Baroque introductions, how do you introduce something into this really kind of laden site? The Washington Fish Market has been the oldest continually operating fish market in the continental United States. Started before the country. There used to be a marketplace on the banks of the river where the settlers would buy fish from Native Americans who would bring it up from the bay, and it was always right there. It was a very important site during the Civil War. It was a takeoff point for Union troops leaving Washington. Across the river, of course, was occupied territory. It was Virginia was part of the Confederacy. Of course, the United States had that, but it was a transportation hub for the military. And ultimately, it became a commercial hub and a bit more than a little seedy after the war. It stayed on as a kind of transportation hub, but it lost some of its commercial nature. There was some wharf buildings that you can see here. But in the early 1900s, about the same time as the McMillan Commission was dealing with the kind of mess of the mall and all the other things that the McMillan plan kind of cleaned up, following up on that, they created a Senate panel to deal with the unsightly and unhealthy conditions of what you saw on the slide before. And so they commissioned, and the city built a series of buildings in the early 1910s. 1912 was the design. 1916, the Washington Fish Market was fully erected. And so you're seeing some of those structures here. And if I start on the top left, that's the Market Hall. That building was where, not unlike Eastern Market, not unlike Central Market, not unlike Union Market, which we've talked about as a studio as well, it was a marketplace that people would come to, buy fresh fish, and they would leave. What happened behind that building was all support. And if you look at the top right image, that's the back of that building. You can kind of see that pedimented end. And just off to the left here is the only remnant of this that remained at the time we got there. It was the oyster shucking shed and the old lunchroom. And so what would happen is the workers would come out. It was only meant for workers. You can see the pile of shells there in that photo. They shuck their shells of oysters and fish, and all that trash went in that shed. And then where the chimney's poking up, that's the lunchroom, which we'll get to. Things changed. The Federal Highway Administration decided to put a bridge across the Potomac, and in doing so, dropped a pier right in the middle of that market. And so that image you see kind of here on the bottom is showing the first pier right against the building that we were. This is the historic lunchroom right here, and you can see by that point the shed had been enclosed and added onto, and to which point you could never really even recognize. And I'll show you some photos of when we got there. And then this is the Washington Fish Market after they had finished the off-ramp to 395. So not much left. If you were able to squint your eyes and kind of see, you'd see that we had our little building there and all these barges. Well, the city knew that it was taking away the livelihood of some of these fishmongers who were selling in the market hall. So they agreed that they were going to put them out on the barges in a temporary condition. And so the barges show up in a 1980s article here about from the Washington Post that show this kind of direct to from the water to the buyer on the barges that are there off the piers that are there. And so this is the kind of mess that we inherited that they asked us to take a look at. So when we got down there, and I'm looking at my students and other students here, when we got there, it's not unlike the site across the railroad tracks that we're looking at here. It was a mess. It really wasn't a lot going on, but the city had taken the entire wharf through a series of property ownership issues and commissioned a master plan by Hoffman Associates. And part of that master plan included a PUD, but that stopped at the Washington Fish Market because it was beloved by the people who still used these kind of barges out on the water. And the city loved that for the cultural impact that it had. Again, no context we're dealing with here, except for what you see here is the little remnants of that oyster shed and historic lunchroom that had already been kind of enclosed there. They'd cut through the wall. There was no wall below that roof of the brick that you see there. We had to rebuild that. In fact, we couldn't get into this building because it was piled high with just junk that folks had put in there. So it was a long time coming before we could even climb into the two buildings. It also had all the electrical services, a bunch of trash and stuff kind of all strewn around this sad remnant of what was the original historic fish market from, again, the 1916 version, not the previous iterations. And so the wharf had these kind of connections that it was making to the city that we paid attention to. This is, of course, everything turned out well down there for those of you who've been, but at the time it was a pretty big challenge. There was all these moments where the city meets the water, and the master plan for the wharf called for open view sheds out into the water, and we had one of those here at the termination of L'Enfant Plaza over here. And we sat as a separate precinct on the Jefferson side, knowing that we were going to be the first encounter that a tourist might have walking from the National Mall down to the wharf. So we knew we wanted to be something different. We also didn't want to turn our back on the kind of honky-tonk nature, carnival-like nature of what the fish market had become. This is part of the context of the play. So we've got these historic structures. In fact, they've been selling food there for 200 years and these kind of barges of fish. And so we did this initial sketch here, which really kind of held the idea of taking the barges and the kind of almost kind of, carnival-like midway where they were selling the fish. And we took that idea and said, well, what if we wrapped that kind of retail opening around and focused all of these buildings that we're going to propose on the historic structures in a way that we took what was this sad remnant and made it the highlight, the gem, the object in the void of the space, not unlike what I mentioned about Rome, right? And so the yellow that you see here is the kind of retail frontages that we propose to be sticking out towards there to face that red object building. What you see in pink are kind of subtle markers of how our precinct is different than the PUD of the large 10-story buildings that happen right starting at that green ribbon that you see here. And the blue kind of having some muscular buildings that stand up to the edges of the site. And then the green being a kind of marketplace. And that little green with the C is our intervention to get the views to the water. What we started to notice in the plans that we were reviewing for the rest of the fish market was that architects were starting to be pushed by the developer and the builders of those buildings to get wider and wider and wider and actually disassociate the view from the city to the water. And I felt very strongly when we started this that we needed to keep that building as skinny as possible to keep those views. So here's the kind of plan of the new buildings, 1 historic, 5 new. We, knew that they were going to be putting on this portion of the wharf, that there was going to be ground floor retail, but we were really trying to set up a food-focused, food-forward kind of urban plan. But we also had to deal with a lot of the remnants of this 1960s highway blowing through the site. So we had to keep the bridge. We had to keep the pier that you saw that photo of. And we had to, by the way, keep it so that if somebody put a bomb underneath it, you could see in. So we needed to have that to be visible from the street. And how do you create a street wall when you got to have visibility around this thing? That's all sitting on these super deep piles and piers. And there's a whole set of floodproofing issues that I won't get into. But, the idea of trying to create a people space that is a different but associated precinct to the wharf was the challenge. So here it is today. And you can see if you've been there, it's a fairly lively place. We had 17 phases of construction in here where we had to move. We couldn't lose a parking space during construction. So we had to build and get all of the electrical and all that storage and trash off of that historic structure and move it over to a building that was wrapping around that pier that I mentioned. And then we had to go back and build these other structures below grade, elevators. This is all built on a pier. So there's wood about 15 feet down holding up dirt that we had to get through to get down through oyster shell and peanut butter, as the structural engineer described it, to support the buildings. I always imagine that someday the water will be gone and the mud will be gone and dirt will be gone and our buildings will be there on all these micropiles. We had about 1,600 micropiles that these things were all sitting on. So how do you tie that back to the city? How do we tie that to the way that the public may be moving to the wharf, both on Main Avenue out away from the water, but also on the water side? And so we had to deal with that. We had to come down from L'Enfant Plaza. We also had an 8-foot drop across our site that we had to get ADA to work. And so there's a sophisticated set of stramps and things that gets you down from this high point of the site, of our site, down to the low point over here at the wharf. I mean, at the barges there. And so, this permeability and the ability to kind of see in there, again, the idea of precedent, the idea of context, and the idea of solid and void, always informing how we reacted to that. And so here's just some images of built. You can see that thin building that we insisted on keeping less than 18 feet. And so that's this building here with the view from the water, the kind of tall buildings that define the edges of ours versus the tall building adjacent to our parcel. And then how magical this place can be at night, because it's really of a human scale. And this is kind of the ADA ramp that gets us down. And this pass through that gets to that ramp actually is required to get from parking out to here. So that's how people come. And then there was this break in this building here that we did because we wanted to be able to perceive that historic structure from the street. And so rather than that being a bar building, we elected to kind of pull that apart so that as you're driving down and you look over or walking down and look over, you actually get a glimpse of those 2 historic remaining structures, again, which had been so abused over the years. So how do we then think about architecture, and how do we use what little bit we had as precedent to come up with a whole new program and to really refer back to the kind of carnival-like stuff that I mentioned? And so we took the kind of remnant of the oyster shed and decided that the steel columns, which were in really bad shape, you can kind of see those here. Again, we couldn't get in this building for months and months and months because it was stacked to the rafters with stuff. We took every rafter off. We took every metal piece off, counted them all, marked them all up, laid them down on a site, held the roof up on the lunchroom, and then we inserted a glass box on the inside. So this exoskeleton of structure defines the shape of the skin of the historic oyster shed, and we put the glass box inside that. And then we restored the historic lunchroom, which, by the way, it sunk 18 inches from this corner to this corner. We couldn't really level that out. So if you go down there, you'll see some sloped bricks. That wasn't us, that was gravity. And so that defined, how we dealt with the historic building. But then how do you create that in a way that maintains as much historic structure and fabric as it can? And so if you look closely, which I can't do because I don't have my glasses on here, but if you look closely, there are moments like you see here. Everything below that patch panel was rusted out to the degree that it wouldn't hold the building up. And so we cut those off at different heights. And if you go down there today, you'll see these plates, and we purposefully showed those. The new columns down below into the micropiles through the water. And then the stuff above is all historic. So the roof is all original down to those plates, and those plates happen in different locations. And so that's it from the water, creating these kind of small, intimate spaces around this building as object, and letting the buildings that surround it be the solid. But then how do we articulate an architecture of the new buildings that is reminiscent of the oyster shed and uses that precedent in a kind of contemporary way that allows us to do these new uses? And so we took the idea of this exoskeleton, of these columns outside of the glass, and we said, well, let's treat every building that way. Let's think about the columns being long and spindly and putting the glass and the metal panel inboard of that. And so as you walk around the site, all of the buildings reflect that in combination with that kind of colored diagram I showed. But you can see the kind of columns on that thin building are actually, talk about, really having to fight the developer to keep that thin. The 18 feet is the outside of the column, so inside it's like 16 feet wide. So here it is, again, from the water, showing that kind of language of architecture that we took and kind of modified in terms of precedent. So, I think the idea of solid and void, the idea of precedent and context. In this case, we had very little context except for its history and understanding that history and those two kind of sad buildings that were left and what we've been able to do with them. We didn't want to turn our back on the context of what people's recent memory, and by recent, like the last 40, 50 years, of the fish market was, which was exactly this kind of honky-tonk thing I talked about. And so we encouraged, and in some cases, introduced murals to kind of celebrate the kind of quirky nature of those vendors throughout the buildings. So when you go down here and you see those murals that are on some of these buildings and wonder why, it was really our attempt to try to make sure that we were thinking about the entire context of the site. Of course, there's all kinds of sustainable lessons that we did here. These are all LEED buildings. It was a LEED campus building. We had all kinds of sustainable stormwater measures that we took. And you can see Main Avenue quite busy in that break in the building that gives you the view here. And so there it is at night. Okay. So the next project is going to be somewhat familiar to those of you in a 302 studio, because this is a project we did over at the Union Market area with the same developer. Actually, all three of these are going to be with the same developer. This is a competition entry that we were asked to join that was master planned, and not unlike how some of the studios are doing it, master planned by a big firm, Perkins Eastman, master planned the wharf. They were asked to master plan this, and then Hoffman parceled up 3 sites and asked 3 firms, Perkins Eastman, ourselves, and studios, to take a look at 3 parcels. And we have a lot of involvement with campus communities right outside of the perimeter of traditional college campuses, and they knew that, and they asked us to take this site adjacent to Gallaudet. So for folks who aren't familiar with Gallaudet's relationship to this, Gallaudet is a lovely kind of green oasis in the city that's pretty cut off from the Union Market area. We were asked in the city's master planning here, are in alignment with what Gallaudet was trying to do, which was integrate itself and its students into the community in a way that previously it had not been challenged to do. So deaf students, being in the community, there's a whole set of deaf space standards, which I feel like there was somebody doing a lecture here about deaf space standards. Gallaudet proposed those. Those were new when we did this. But how do you tie that campus into Union Market? And our site was owned by Gallaudet. It's that parking garage that is familiar to those of you in 302 this year here, as well as this bowstring truss building we had to keep, and that little kind of service bay we had to keep. And so we paid attention to the kind of context of what was out there, and the developer was pretty keen on kind of doing something similar to the meatpacking district up in New York City. And so we took a look at what does that mean? Of course, there is this tradition of warehouses that folks in 302 know about Union Market in terms of the warehouse and the history I went over when we were standing out there. But the idea of how do you take warehouses and turn them into residential buildings, which is really what was driving this program. I missed that slide, I guess. And so what we noticed about the meatpacking district was that the buildings were kind of turned in their short axis in a lot of cases. So the warehouses, rather than being big, broad fronts, were actually rotated. And so it gave us a kind of breakdown in the scale that we thought was kind of interesting. And then these kind of canopy overhangs that are part of that. We also knew that there was all kinds of functions that they wanted to have on our site that were incubator spaces for Gallaudet students. And so they were looking for artist studios and kind of co-working studios like we work. And this was all from the RFP that the developer received of what they needed to put onto our parcel. And so we were given this program, And on the left, it said you need to have this many units, this much retail, this and that. And the developer and Perkins Eastman had kind of worked this out and said, okay, this pencils out. We can make this work. And so our project was 1, A, B, and C, and 2. And so we had a kind of allocated number of units we had to hit here, and a master plan that a lot of you will be walking away from in a couple of weeks, that we had to decide how we were going to abide with the master plan that we were handed. So that was the master plan we were handed. For those of you who've been on Gallaudet's campus, it has these kind of wonderful faculty-like housing that fronts out onto Olmsted Green. It also has this crazy building, which I call kind of hyper Tudor, which I'm not sure if anybody has actually seen it, but it's even more vivid in real life. And it has kind of Tudor elements throughout. That is the context that we were kind of thinking about, as well as the precedent that we were thinking about when we got to this project. And then we noticed that like there's these wonderful kind of spaces between these residences that nobody's taking advantage of. And it kind of died in this wall of that service bay. And so how might you consider that? And so we came up with kind of 3 schemes in no particular order, although the one on the bottom right is the one we ended up with. One of the things I think I pointed out to everybody when we were standing out there is this alignment of 6th is not parallel to the rest of streets in Capitol Hill. It's actually angled, and you get this amazing view towards Capitol Hill. And so we pointed this out to the developer and said, you're giving up all these views. If you do the building that you had proposed, or an E-shaped building, the only people who are going to get that view are the people on the south side. So what if we put a slash through the site? Or what if we kind of permeated the buildings in a way that welcomes students from Gallaudet to move back and forth from the campus, and people likewise from moving from the Union Market area into the campus? And then how do you articulate that bar of a building so that it isn't that kind of blank wall as you're looking from Gallaudet? And so, it was a memorable story. I presented this to Stan Exet, who, is a pretty big name in urban design. And he was a principal in charge of master planning for Perkins Eastman at the time. And the developer looked at him and said, Stan, what do you think? Because they had just finished the master plan for the wharf. And Stan said, look, what I really want to do is go back and tell my staff to start over. But what I think is the right thing to do here is let these guys do what they're doing, because they're attacking this site in a way that their team just had not started to think of. So no pressure. That was our first meeting. So what are you going to come up with on the next meeting? And so we started to kind of diagram out what this meant in terms of the permeability, the accessibility in 2 locations to Gallaudet. One is in front of Union Market. We knew that they wanted to have a big kind of monumental piece to mark that entrance and kind of tear down that awful parking garage that's there. But they also wanted to have the students have this much easier way to get to the metro at the corner here. But we had to retain the bowstring truss building, and we could tear down a little bit of that. And so these are just some of our concept diagrams that evolved into this. And so if I take you through these diagrams in terms of understanding context and precedent, and again, object void, the gateway buildings, and how do those start to take on prominence in a way that maybe the other buildings don't? The kind of idea of permeable links to campus, and how do you allow people to move in a way that feels like you're passing a threshold, but not isolated or belonging to one or the other? Views towards the Capitol, incubator space, and the idea of being able to roll out stuff like artwork and things that they told us they wanted to have there, and creating open space that they could do that in that's car free. And then finally, giving as much views and light to the south and to the east into that space. And so here's the final kind of proposal. Once all the architects got together and put it all together, the hyper Tudor building that I mentioned is here. You can start to see our exponentially hyper Tudor building here, and our new entrance down here with our new kind of addition to the bowstring arch, and this kind of carved out V space that gives all those units now views to the Capitol. This is a mixed use building. Our studio just finished their precedent studies, and we've pointed out that most of the precedents that we all looked at did not have ground floor mixed use. But I think we all recognize that a ground floor retail plane is a pretty nice way of enlivening a street. And so we have on the top plan here, our retail space is facing 6th, our incubator spaces for the arts kind of thing happening, and the business incubation happening up in our kind of triangular shaped court, and then kind of permeable lobby here, and the ability to walk back and forth through that building into campus. And then residential, we took it to the level of the demising wall here with a roof plan. And so sectionally, and in elevation, it's a bunch of kind of building elements turned sideways, like those warehouses that we mentioned, with those glass views towards the south. We turned that bay into a kind of rooftop gathering space that you could go up to. There's a little tower that has, you know, an elevator in it here so that you could have accessibility to this with those views down to the Capitol that I mentioned. This is those kind of warehouse edges facing 6th Street. So it's much more of a brick exposure towards 6th Street. And then this kind of hyper Tudor response to this gateway site. This is the first gateway site down on Florida Avenue, trying to transition in the scale from Florida up into campus and create a kind of green landscaped place between the gate that's there. It's right now pretty horrific trying to get into campus. And then this is the edge towards 6th with those brick facades. And then finally, the view to the Capitol with that object building that defines the entry. So again, all three things I think are present here: object, context, and precedent. So the last project I wanted to walk you all through is a project down at Audi Field. It's parcel B at Audi Field. This is very relevant to the studio. This is a mixed use, 650,000 square foot multi-use building. It has on the ground floor, it's got an office entry that leads up to second floor office over here. It's got market rate residential in the white, and then over in the red over here is senior affordable housing. Inside this kind of brick base is a venue called Brooklyn Bowl, which is it's a place you go bowling or go hear a concert. It's kind of crazy, but they exist. It's in New York. Now they're in Colorado, and we're the first site here. And then it's also immediately adjacent to the front door of Audi Field. So if you know Audi Field and had the opportunity to walk there from the ballpark metro, Audi Field is parcel A, and this is parcel B. Parcel B was given when the developer bought the team. I'm sorry, when the owner bought the team, he got the site, and he's not a developer. And so he hired Hoffman to take a look at this. And so this is the site today. This is in for permit and kind of dealing with interest rates and a bunch of other things. But this is the site today. And if you guys know Buzzards Point, there's been development that Anchorage has done south of the stadium. Down here, the stacks, the new bridge across South Capitol. This is Nationals Park. And this whole kind of development of trying to link Audi Field out to the water. And so our site sits here. This is South Capitol Street and the Frederick Douglass Bridge, which actually doesn't kick out at this angle from National Park here. And so we knew we were kind of fitting into this new promenade that is happening there. And so as we do with all, we kind of sketched out what does it mean at the city scale and what does it mean at the kind of block scale, and how do you get from Audi Field to the water through our building, and how does our building not become this super solid mass that blocks the ability to get towards the water if you're coming or leaving via boat taxi. And then this kind of gives you the breakdown that I was talking about diagrammatically of how the building works, with office in the blue, senior affordable in the dark orange, our market rate here, and then the retail down below. And then we shaped the building so that you had these views to the Capitol and views to the water and to the new bridge. Just some of those diagrams again at the top from a different angle. But when it comes to how do you deal with the ground floor retail, so this had a bunch of different entries. We had a bunch of retail entries that we wanted to do, but we also had residential entries. So our residential lobby is what you see here. We have an office lobby that you see here in red, and then we have the senior affordable that's here. There's a massive Pepco easement that comes across here that we had to stay off of and deal with, a bunch of underground electrical lines that are down there. And then we have 3 stories of parking below there. And as you get up above all of this, and this is Brooklyn Bowl's big footprint you see here, as you get up above all of this, how does that break down into a double loaded corridor, providing kind of market rate units with a range of unit types, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, with as much outdoor space as they can have, and kind of common space up on the roof. So, we'll get to this in the studio, but kind of testing out each unit to make sure that the furniture works and that the unit is viable. A lot of these are maisonettes or duplexes where you have 2 floors of living. And you can see there was a huge range of those. And so this is just it from the street. Audi Field on the left. On the right is our building. And you'll see that pass through is kind of over here, that break. And this is just kind of a normal day down here, but we also had to think about, the procession from Nationals Park to Audi Field. And so we kind of gathered retail onto that, facing out onto that plaza. That was pretty sad in that photo I showed you today. And then we had to think about game day and what happens on game day. And so how do you close this street on a game day event so that people can just turn it into pedestrian only? And so I'll blow this up here in a moment. This is Brooklyn Bowl that wants to have its frontage out towards there. And then folks have started to do street sections and looked at that. Yes, we do those professionally over and over and over again. This was one of many that kind of get to the issue of outdoor space for the uses that are in there. And then, so this one on the bottom left is a typical day where the road is open. And then on the bottom right, what's shown in red is what's closed on game day. So we had to think about that as well. And here's Brooklyn Bowl at night. And market rate units above, again, with their own little balconies there, ended up with 395 units in this, and then 170 or some of senior affordable. And then here it is sitting on that plaza with with Audi Field there. And then here's that power plant that has these Pepco easements coming through here. So hopefully that kind of gets my point across in terms of how I was able to take the kind of stuff that Jason and I talked about at the beginning of this talk about Rome and what did I learn in Rome and how do you apply Rome through the filter of an American place, and how do you take some of the lessons that you all are engaged in, not just as third years, but certainly my urban design students from last summer, and folks who've been over to Rome. How do you take those lessons and apply it? I can tell you that I had no idea at the time that it was obviously going to turn into something like this. And I think in reflection about this idea of solid void, precedent, and context, I think urban design done well is a bit anonymous or agnostic when it comes to style. I think urban design done well and buildings done well that respond to the idea of context and solid and void in the city, I think can be real contributors to contemporary urban living. So this is just a kind of range of other projects we do, all of which kind of reflect a bit of what I've talked about here. And I thought I'd end on, this quote from Corbu, which always bothered me when I got back from Rome, quite frankly, because Corbu says that Rome is for wise men only and for those who can know and who can resist, and that Rome is really the damnation of the half-educated. And I would say that I was half-educated when I got there, and I feel like I was fully educated by the time I left. And so taken in that context, maybe I'm not so offended by his quote, but I would encourage any of you who haven't had the opportunity to go over there. I know there's a Rome studies. You guys have the opportunity of studying over there. I can promise you that it'll change your life. It did for Jason and I. We've been all over the world, the two of us, not together, but all over the world. And there's no place like Rome. And I think taken in the right light, it holds innumerable lessons for folks at all kinds of levels. So with that, I'll kind of open it up for questions. I appreciate your all's time. Thank you for being here. Is Jason still on? He had a
Oh, yeah.
train. No? Oh, I finished before 6,
Maybe.
so it's almost dinner.
Nope, he's no longer.
Yeah, he had to catch a train, he told me so.
I'm gonna stop sharing. Cause then we can go to.
Okay, great. Anybody with questions or no? Was that clear? Please. I'll give you this. I can talk here. That's it.
My question's from the beginning when you were talking about different precedents and using specifically the application of Glenstone for a roundhouse project.
Mhm.
Did you say the roundhouse was your project?
Yeah, so that project is, you've been to the mall, you've seen the carousel. That's not the original carousel. The original carousel is actually in Wheaton, Maryland. And we're building a new roundhouse. It's under construction. To give you a sense of architecture, we won that project we started in 2013. We're in 2016. It was supposed to be done in April of last year. It's still under construction, not because of us, just complications with the site around it. But yes, so it's a carousel roundhouse. It's got a little ticket booth and some restrooms for the park up there in Clarksburg, Maryland at Ovid Hazen. But yes, the precedent that I was using there, if I go back, I guess this is part of being an architect, and the curse of having an architect as a parent is you're always getting dragged to places that you don't know what you're looking at. And so you're observing and remembering and always kind of going back. I didn't look at the Charleston Side Yard House or that farmstead for these projects. That was just something that was in my mind that I'd taken a picture of because I thought it was really interesting the way the buildings sat in the landscape. And so, we collect these moments in our experience as precedent. And so I just found that kind of image of Glenstone and how it sits in the kind of fields an interesting kind of corollary to how a farmyard in Montgomery County's ag reserve sits. And then that's kind of how we've structured our roundhouse here, is sitting in a landscape of adjacent farms.
My question was pertaining to the solid and void aspect. Did you just focus on the building itself of Glenstone for your precedent or the experience of Glenstone? Because those are two very different.
Very different. Yes. No, we did both. So when we were hired in 2013 to do this, it was a master plan, park plan. And if you know Hovet Hazen Wells Park, there's this kind of crescendo to a high spot on the site. And they have this kind of slowly sloping lawn that they do this kite festival in. And so everybody just thought, put the building up there, put this carousel up there. And so we got there and we're like, okay, certainly we could put a big carousel there that, is a 2-minute ride for 8-year-olds, which is great. We love the building, right? But it's not the whole park. And so we said we would like to think about how do you take the idea of what a park should be, and this is a 350-acre park. How do you take the idea of what a park should be, and how does this become one of many elements? And so we started to pool. This had a playground immediately adjacent to it, the carousel, a bunch of picnic pavilions, and it was all going to go and get slammed up on the top of the hill. And we said, well, why don't we try to create a sequence through the park? And so Glenstone is about a sequence through a landscape, and it culminates in the building. And if you pay enough attention there's actually another building, the Gwathmey building, that was the original one that's also part of that. And so not just the way the building sat in the landscape. By the time we got to the building design, of course, we were thinking about, how a building sits within its surrounding landscape as an object. But it was part of a bigger kind of sequence that we had also, and by the Glenstone was not open when we started the project, so we kind of pulled this apart before we'd been to Glenstone. If folks haven't been to Glenstone, it's a fun thing to see for those reasons. But we also wanted the building shape to kind of capture the motion of the carousel, and so the kind of uplifting roof, and the drum of that was based on Washington's circular barn. If you've been to Mount Vernon and seen that barn, the materials we chose there again to try to refer back in terms of. Again, it's not really the context that's there. We're in the agricultural reserve and it's an agricultural context, but drawing on precedent.
Thank you.
Anna?
Thank you for your lecture. I was wondering specifically regarding like the historic preservation part of the fish market project. Why is it that you chose to reflect the kind of glass and steel look of the fish market building when I know there's some discussion in historic preservation generally about whether or not to make those buildings feel very distinct. And because it's kind of treated as an object building, I'm wondering why it was that you decided to kind of repeat that sort of representation in the other buildings instead of leaving it as like the building that has this feature.
And it's a very good question. We're not preservationists. We do preservation like any architectural firm practicing in Washington. You're always cheek to jowl with preservation issues. And so when you're working on a project like this, you have a number of kind of approval agencies that you have to go through, not just the Historic Preservation Group, but you have the Commission of Fine Arts and the Shipstead Luce overlay here. There's a lot of people poking and prodding at these things. And I think one of the things that we do well is to bring the dialogue to the forefront so that we can balance all of those concerns. And so there's a lot of competing voices in these agencies, in these local community groups, the advisory neighborhood commissions that have a say in these kinds of things. And so I think the idea of kind of creating a focus on here and highlighting all the preservationists, the support that we got from HPRB on this was, look, if you fix this building and do what you did here and reflect its architecture somehow in the surrounding buildings without being too derivative of that, we will not fight you on, the heights and all the other issues that they could get in on. And so it was a little bit of a backdoor deal with them because, we kind of sailed through on the preservation side, but I also think that it's pretty apparent when you're down there, when you're looking even at the aerial of this, the buildings that are historic and the buildings that aren't. And so we struggled with painting that building white, the lunchroom, because it was originally red. And we tried about 7 different lime wash removals. We had the historic preservation folks out there with us as we were doing the citrics, removing all this stuff. We just couldn't get it off. And so we had, analysis of that. And so the building is actually white. And then we had new brick and filling stuff where the walls had been removed. And so we had to kind of find a white wash that would match that. And so it does kind of blend in, I think, from a color standpoint to the buildings around it. But our original intention was that was going to be red brick. And so we just couldn't get it back to the red brick because of the lime wash that had been put on the outside. And, you know, we play with the role of preservation, and do you emulate it or do you not? And it depends, honestly, on the jurisdiction and the sophistication of the reviewing agencies who are approving that. Some want you to be derivative. Some don't. DC, you're right. They're more often asking us to do something like any of our school projects that you've seen, where the new has to be distinctly different from the old.
Thank you.
Yep. No other questions? One more. Oh, Mark, please. Yes.
Talk a little bit about character, maybe it's the side character. You know, the fish market here is a good example of the new and the old are projecting a similar ambiance.
Mhm.
Right, you talk about its hump character, that was something we tried to capture in the new buildings. Could you talk a little bit about how in some of the other projects, maybe the Italian Field project, how the facade, the vertical dimension
Mhm.
expresses.
Everybody heard Mark's question, Dean Ferguson's question here about character, and how this reflects character. Okay, so there's a number of things that we had to take into account here. One is there's nothing down there at the time we did this. So it's another one of these sites that was devoid of context. Audi Field certainly was a new project that had been introduced, and there was all these kind of master plan ideas happening around the building. But it was our expectation we were going to be the first out of the ground. In fact, we might be the last. But that wasn't how it was designed. We won the job before COVID and did most of the work over 2021 during COVID. And so we were dealing with what we had been given in terms of these big, broad kind of openings at Audi Field, and the lack of a context again. And so in this case, there was very little historic pieces to kind of refer to. There was no shared history down here that we found. We did, however, had the power plant to the south, which I mentioned, which is this kind of beautiful kind of bayed structure down here. And it's white brick, separated from ours by a huge substation of, you know, I don't know what they are, transformers, I guess, or power. I don't know what you call these things that are just a field of them between us and them. And so that's kind of where the color came out of. And then when you're dealing with, you know, a project of this scale, again, there's groups who are involved with these reviews. In this review, it was not HPRB because it wasn't a historic building. It was the ANC group, the Area Neighborhood Commission, Advisory Neighborhood Commission, sorry, and CFA was not involved in this. So the context of trying to set up a kind of solid base, you know, my studio spent a lot of time in their individual analyses of facades of, you know, residential buildings that have a solid base, a kind of interesting middle, and a finalized top. In this case, we tried to do something like that with the kind of solid base of retail and office, this kind of interesting middle that leads to a different kind of top where the arches, the kind of gentle arch up there. I always find, you know, organizing a big elevation, my students have heard this over and over again, designing and organizing a big elevation, that is hard stuff. Like, I don't know that I'm very good at it, quite frankly, with you, to be honest. You know, it's just hard to get a big building to break down in scale in a way that is legible, if you will, I find, Mark. So, you know, the stepping back and all of that, that was probably comments that we got from, I believe those were from the developer who wanted to have outdoor space at the penthouse level, but also from the neighborhood who kind of wanted to keep the sun from shining too, the shadow from being cast too dramatically onto that plaza leading up. And so, you know, it's hard. Like I abide by what I said, by that quote, you know, the Colin Rowe quote about objects. The problem with modern architecture, I think, is everybody thinks that they need to be shouting about how important their building is. And I just don't believe that. I think when you come into a setting like this, where you have no context, you know, you have to make choices about that. And so organizing an elevation, I think, is done fairly successfully here. There's always room for improvements, but, you know, that's to me, one of the hardest things to do in housing, because, you know, you got these repetition of units that stack up and this repetition of windows. So how do you gather those in a way that, you know, starts to organize the elevation without it just being a kind of blank, flat wall? So anybody doing housing for very long places, you know, I could see you, Eduardo, knowing these problems very well. Is that good? Yes. Yeah.
Oh, well, the other thing I was just gonna note that, you know, it reads as four separate buildings, so you've got breaks down scale in that way, suggests a variety of uses, which I guess commercially, limited variety.
Well, and we did that intentionally, the kind of S that the buildings, we call it the Jello mold, the S shape. We did that intentionally to break down the scale on all sides of the long block. So it's, when you stand down there, it is a big block that we're dealing with, 650,000 square feet. And you know, you're trying to organize this and plan and in section and elevation. And by the way, you got acoustic problems because somebody's playing the drums below units. So, you know, the ins and outs of that and the setbacks were all meant to kind of give a variety to what's happening above. And I think there's some lessons from the wharf, not our project at the wharf, but if you're walking along the wharf, Hoffman certainly had taken some real lessons about the importance of the ground plane and the kind of texture of the ground plane, as well as those first couple of stories, because the wharf, at least phase one, has a very consistent kind of retail base, and then the residential changes up above. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the lecture. In the situation with the Audi Field project, do you think it is more difficult when there is no
Context.
and to create something like that? And if so, do you then use precedent to create potential site context to help you develop some sort of plan?
Response, yes. You know, I kind of said this before I got into the projects, all three of these, and we have a ton of projects I could have called up, but I wanted to be more appropriate to the theme of the studio. All three of these balance those three issues of solid void, precedent, and context in some degree. And so, you know, when you get to a site that you have the opportunity to work on, let's just take the Brookland site, which, you know, is the thesis of the second half of the studio. Randy went through a whole set of context, and history is context to me. And so nothing's left over there. We got a big, awful bus depot, and you know, we have Colonel Brooks. So how do we emphasize that? How do we deal with this remnant of a mansion? It's got its back turned to Monroe. That's a challenge. So I like, and you guys who are participating in my studio today from Patricia's studio saw the Culpeper project, where I like to go back and think about history on all our projects if we have the opportunity to do that. And I think certainly the Brookland site allows for that.
Close up soon.
It's going to close us down. Allows for that. So my first inclination is to go to history. What I've asked my students to do is to come to the class. We didn't do this on our first project. We started on this project. It's going to continue on the urban design and the building design, is to come to class with a precedent. And so for the housing typologies, I picked 12 precedent that I felt had a variety of kind of applications for the whole group to learn about. And so we spent, I don't know, what is it, 5-10 minutes? Everybody kind of just goes through. It's not like they're not doing a book report. It's go look at this building and let's look at it together and see what it's doing on the street, in the units, and in section. And we're going to do that for master plans as well. So I think master planning precedent is a little maybe somewhat foreign to the kind of pedagogy of being taught how to design a building. And again, I didn't have that until I was in Rome, of how to think about urban design. And so I'll have the students going out, this next 6 classes, going out and looking at urban designs that have been built around Washington, and actually going out and coming back and doing show and tell, we'll call it, back at the studio. So I think the more kind of you just develop this kind of vocabulary of solutions of precedent, the more you'll start to say, well, it's not exactly like that, and maybe it's not like that at all, but it reminds me of that in this way. And that's how you start to derive your solutions. So I would say never stop learning. You know, I'm always looking at precedent. And our office always starts projects with precedent and analysis. All set? Anyone else? Thank you all.
Bye, CJ.